we're back here because you've had an incredible campaign. Absolutely, you've been blitzing it. I mean, you've been doing the German blitz through the podcast arena. You've been interview after interview after interview. You must be almost exhausted. How are you faring, Johann BenZion?
Feeling pretty good, feeling strong. Yeah, but it's a lot of interviews. Sometimes talking to people 5-6 hours a day, prepping interviews and setting that stuff up. That's I get the gift of gab, I guess, but it gets a little tiring. But I'm glad to be doing it. It's a privilege to be able to do this. The founder of the Transhumanist Party, Zoltan Isfin, he said that everybody's contribution to super longevity, to life extension, you're doing yourself a service, you're doing other people a service. This is even the smallest bit of this is a worthwhile act. And so that's been my sort of a source of a lot of that energy for me. And it's fun. I enjoy talking about this stuff. You and I talking a little bit about the even more fringe stuff than transhumanism a moment ago, and I'm excited to get into some of that. I've been doing a series of interviews with techno-spiritualists, talking about a resurrection documentary that I'm making. And, we're approaching this stuff from a near term and hard science to the degree that that's realistic. This project incorporates a kind of special effects that are, it's not a woo-monger undertaking, but to get into some of this stuff, you are sometimes are talking about metaphysical concepts that have parallels in futurism studies, and so it's fun. You and I were talking about the Christian Transhumanist Association, and these are great guys, and they're not, maybe I don't know what impression your viewers in Australia have of the United States, but about 20% of people would be a very socially conservative religious people, 20% of maybe, let's say, Christians. And then another 20% of those are sort of adjacent to that. So it's a little bit different than in Europe, where a lot of people are maybe post-Christian or more religious moderate inclined. So in the United States, when I talk to people who are not people of faith about these syncretic religious organizations like the Mormon Transhumanist Association, the Christian Transhumanist Association, their first thought is that these must be kind of very superstitious people. But in point of fact, I have not met religious transhumanists who are religious literalist people. They don't necessarily believe that Jesus Christ rose from the grave and therefore we must worship him. And to those people who do believe that, very well. But these are a different sort of people. They are approaching this by and large from an idea that the ideas of Christianity or the ideas of other religious traditions in conjunction with that can inspire us to greater heights as techno-optimists. And that is something that I can absolutely support. I think we have to allow for people to be guided by these traditions and these parts of themselves.
Yeah, because you just did the interview with Michael Redding of the Christian Transhumanist Association, and he had a lot of very interesting things to say. And he says that these ideas of longevity, super longevity, good lifespans, and transhumanism are not antithetical to what Jesus taught. It's not contrary to the Bible, and this is straight from the horse's mouth. And they're saying that these things were prophesied in the Book of Revelation and other places. What do you think? Because I found that an absolutely fascinating interview. I thought that was great because finally. A culture that isn't implied in a death sequence, as a fulfillment to an eternal promise. What do you think? Did you think that was an interesting revelation?
I think that the Christian tradition can give so much is a guiding and organizing principle for resurrectionists. And in these most common of traditions, it's the Mormons are very well suited to this particularly as well. And Mormon people, many of them are, quite a few of them are also quite conservative and religious literalist people. But the Mormon transhumanist does have these ideas of very specific to advanced technology being the way in which these stories are ultimately being implemented. And I feel that any tradition that doesn't describe itself as necessarily being factionalist is a tradition that I will find agreeable. I literally do feel that a person who is a religious literalist who would describe other people as heretics, that person is themselves the heretic. That's the enemy. That's the enemy of man. And I don't want to call out some particular tradition or some particular person in that regard. But I don't think it's unreasonable to say that if you're setting yourself up as somebody who is a warmonger, that's a problem. If you're setting up as some more philosophical notion and some more goal-oriented notion, that's a reasonable thing to do. Relative, I mean, maybe on some of these points, I think in the Abrahamic faith, I feel that the Judaic tradition excels compared to the other Abrahamic faiths. But on this particular point of life extension, I think that the Christian tradition is a pretty good fit. Even I think that even the Muslim tradition too much in these concerns about the Muslim world. I feel that some of it derives from political and economic stability, and that I feel that in a better world, all of these Abrahamic faiths will be very steadily moving towards these life extension and other transhumanist goals.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think it's interesting too that in the Mormons, for example, the Mormons have in their theology that God is a physical man, essentially, and that it's all biological based, and that once you die, you go on to be the creators, the gods over your own planets of physical beings. So it's this mesh of spirituality and organisms, and they're coming together through a super spiritual technology, which enables you to then rule other pseudo-spiritual organic beings, and it perpetuates on and on and on when you have perpetual wives and lives. I think that's fascinating. And you yourself wanted to do a small documentary on Mormons who were transhuman. What motivated you to do that? Why do you look at that as an option?
Yeah, that's true. So David Kelly, another guy who I interviewed from this area, and who has we talked more about programming was the thrust of that interview. But he has a transhumanist house in this area, in the Greater Salt Lake City area, and it's sort of a haven for transhumanists. And some of the guys who stay there and visit there, it's a really cool scene. But moreover, the Salt Lake City area has a lot of wonderful things about it. And there's also a lot of quite a bit of a kind of religious diversity there. So people don't always realize that. But it is kind of a company town in certain respects. But the Mormon Transhumanist Association is really one of the more developed of these kinds of clubs for life extensionists and for people who are interested in these other constellation of ideas around advanced algorithms. So I wanted to depict this side because there's a lot of things, a lot of lovely things to see in a lot of cities around cultural experiences, around emerging culture. But I think that there's a lot of interesting emerging culture in this city that people have a different idea about it being a pretty religious place. And I wanted to show another side of that. That advances my own goals as a life extensionist. So that was the idea of that documentary, and we may still go up and shoot that here towards in the fall. I was going to try and get it into this schedule, but I've been just focusing on these interviews instead.
Yeah, the interviews has been really good. By the way, they've been really fascinating. I'm listening to all of them as they go, and it's good to hear a nice a confluence of ideas, and it's really good. By the way, to people who don't know, the reason we have a clock in the corner is because we have some breaking news that the transhumanist primary has been extended. I think to 10 days from now. So that's the whole clock. That's what we're counting down to. That's the amount of time that these candidates have left until the end, I guess, until we find out who will be the running to become the official president of the United States under the banner of the Transhumanist Party.
Yeah, and that's the following day that e-vote starts. Is August 11th, and then it goes until the 17th. So yeah, there was a little bit of a shift there, but it's still. I don't think people will be inconvenienced by this. It's the e-vote. They're going to get a notification suggesting that they're able to vote at this time. So and some of these things were still already set in place. But yes, I'm pleased with the kind of press that I've been able to do, and I really hope that I've been able to bring life extension and related concepts to people who haven't heard it before. We've certainly been doing a lot of that. I said we said we might talk about the space elevator and the NASA. But there's so many kind of there's so many kind of conspiracy theory things that we can be talking about. NASA's I'm hoping that maybe I'll do another one with Isaac Arthur as well on the space elevator, because we had such a good time talking about digital immortality and similar concepts.
Yeah, digital immortality. It's interesting with Isaac Arthur that he thinks that, I think it's Uranus is going to be one of the biggest places where humanity will live in the future, because it's so cold, and that's the perfect place to run a computer in terms of the mine uploading thing. But we need to get off the planet in order for any of that to happen, and that is the space elevator. I mean, because mind uploading only gets you so far, because you still need energy in order to support the computers that are perpetuating those machines. And there's only the universe is only so big, so even if you do invent a self-replicating machine that can go and eat up energy all over the universe, eventually you will run out of energy. So you have to try and figure out ways to mitigate that crisis. So mind uploading only gets you so far. It isn't the end. Let's just quickly, before we go into space elevators and all that, let's just quickly remind the audience of the Futurist New Deal. This is your key policy. This is what you're talking about. So if anyone who hasn't heard it before, so the Futurist New Deal is about blockchain e-voting, mandated in every state. Digital Wi-Fi for all is a public good and a human right. Enhance e-governance and e-services portables for the people and businesses. Ban all crude oil exports and fossil fuel subsidies. Subsidize the green energy. Decriminalize and release all drug convictions and sex workers from jail. Every K-12 school goes online or has e-learning components. Initiate a full voting by giving added tax benefits to voters. Fully fund universal health care and a robust universal basic income. And your universal basic income is the keystone of the policy. Is there anything you want to tell people? I'll remind people about the Futurist New Deal before we launch into these other conversations.
Yeah, well, I got into it with some Rachel Haywire supporters and with Rachel Haywire herself today. But at the end of that conversation, I said, I give my right arm just to see this kind of policy implemented that she has. Her basic income is funded through different means. It's about half of what ours would be. So it'd be about $500 a week rather than $1,000 a week. But even this would save so many lives. allow us to move toward the kind of civilization where everyone is working on projects that are of value to techno-progressive goals. Everyone is kind of very much more oriented towards futurism, and even if they're oriented towards atavism, they're living reasonably well. They're able to pursue small businesses and better lives, and that's the thing. Somebody commented, a techno-optimist, a transhumanist, commented, this is a guy who believes that full automation is 15 years away. He believes that a fully automated society is something that we can do. But this guy said that he thought that a $52,000 UBI was pretty preposterous. And I said, hey, we're funding this through a specific revenue stream. It's not adding to your middle class tax burden. It's not. Why is this so offensive to you? And I think people want to go into some kind of elitist ideas or kind of defensive notions when you're talking about this. But the simple fact is that it would just be not just adding some millions of jobs to the workforce, but allowing people to really reorient themselves in how they are pursuing work and creating businesses. And that's what we need in the 21st century.
So Andrew Yang talks about his UBI. Obviously, he calls it a freedom dividend.
Yes.
But he also mentions that that people aren't being classified into work as properly. So carers, caregivers, mothers and fathers who stay at home. These aren't added to GDP figures. And he said this is a huge problem because the GDP. Yeah, the GDP is not reflecting correctly the actual amount of work being done. It's only reflecting the amount of goods and services being produced at the end of a system, of a production line, of whatever that production line is. So would you do the same? Would you reclassify what work, the definition of work in the United States would be?
Yeah, I think that it's important to have those figures, and I absolutely would do that. But equally as important is having that the citizens have the political will to assert that in this kind of we're very much somewhat into this world of Buckminster Fuller's ephemeralization, where automation has allowed for people could be working less in a certain sense, and part of that is that we don't define all of these pro-social activities and other kinds of things that are not wholly monetized in appropriate terms. We disregard them, and that leads to other kind of incidental issues. Pay for teachers is very low in the United States. Pay for nurses is often artificially low in the United States, and that is in some way a kind of a feature of this kind of a wrong fixation on certain kinds of work, and which and no one thinks that there shouldn't be nurses or teachers. They're not really given their due, and so there's it's a sad situation. It actually is, and I think that reclassification is an important thing to be doing, and I would probably, as President of the United States, be working with some of the same statisticians and the same organizations that Andrew Yang is working with. I've looked at a lot of that material, and but I think it's equally as important to convince people that they are worthy of this shift in lifestyle, which is not a shift towards some kind of lassitude. It's not a shift towards some kind of a bad behavior. It's a shift towards a better, healthier society that is doing more, and that where people aren't, whatever the actual fact is, in self-report, a solid plurality of people are describing their jobs as make work. They say, I don't think I really need to do this job, and if I wasn't compelled to do it because I need health insurance, because I need this wage to pay my car payment and my mortgage, I really wouldn't be here. And I'm not sure that that's the best organizing principle for new innovations. I think that Andrew Yang has been quite articulate on that point as well.
You know, the Rome invented the census because they needed a way to calculate the people in the empire and other things. So Rome invented the census, and before that, you can go right back to the Bronze Age, and you can look at people who were calculating how much wheat they would have in a granary and how many ale was owed to each other through barter and stuff like that. In China, you had the abacus, which did calculations and stuff. I think we've reached now today an inflection point. And you're hitting on it, and Yang's hitting on it, and all these people talking about it, they're all hitting on it. They're saying that GDP is now outdated. It's an old model. It's dead. It's in the water. We need to change the model. And environmentalists talking about it, the left's talking about it, the right's talking about it in terms of, but we hit this point now here in the 21st century, 2019, 2020, where GDP is now becoming outdated and old-fashioned, and it needs to be switched around. It needs to be redone and remodified to reflect a changing society. And I agree. I think GDP is GNP, GDP, gross local product. All this stuff is now becoming redundant. In the face of automation. I think it's an important figure. Won't argue that, but it doesn't terribly well reflect what's going on. And if you look at the Council of Councils, which is the CFR's derivative, so if you look at the Council of Foreign Relations, which everyone says is a big conspiracy or whatever, but it's not. It's just what it is. The real one has now become the Council of Councils, and they don't use this figure anymore. They don't talk about it. They use a grading figure like you would at school with A, B, C, D, E minus, and they use this figure and they talk about all these other issues, along with a grading system of how well your country is doing, as opposed to just saying, well, the GDP is good, because we're in a multifaceted, multi-complex arena, global arena, and we're competing on all fronts. Like there is a competition now on technology front, on the environment front. China is competing heavily on the environment front. They're planting trees like mad because they realized they went in the wrong direction and that they're going to poison themselves to death. And now it's become a security issue, and they're planting trees like mad. Saudi Arabia is stuck out there in the middle with no resources, and they're planning on building super techno cities that will propel them into the future well beyond anything you can see in the United States or here in Australia or anything, with nano-infused craziness. It's going to be great. So I agree. I think it's GDP is outdated.
Yeah, and the concepts like the Human Development Index, there's a certain. It's a little hard to describe because China in some ways has more state-run capitalism and more syndicalism on some dimensions than the United States. But I think distilling it down to like what you were saying, Human Development Index concepts, really describes the ways in which the United States has fallen behind a little bit. When you talk to people about different forms, small businesses, cooperative businesses, partnerships, they're not as accepting of the idea that they have a certain right to that as much as the idea that they should have a right to be employed by a large multinational corporation. And I think that that's a strange feature. Milton Friedman was a conservative economist, but he wasn't somebody who was preoccupied with enfranchising corporations above everyone else. And so, that's why maybe he was more open to basic income notions, because ultimately, if we one of these organizations without people, and if people are really not flourishing, that's a poor reflection on every human endeavor. And so the idea of shifting to Human Development Index related concepts, as opposed to looking at solely at valuations of markets, it's a much sounder way of looking at these things. But yeah, we do need better metrics even for that. And and Andrew Yang has advanced that.
Yeah, and this is the public debate now, and this being a show that looks at the future of things. I tell you, because I watch the UN ethics debates all the time, and those guys, the feminists have kind of a little bit pushed this, and they say, and social media has sort of slowly awakened people to this notion of online bullying and the digital rights and all this other stuff. That you can't bully in online spaces, even though it's supposed to be anonymous or whatever. But the thing that's coming down the road is, yes, humans are important, but humans are also starting to slowly fade out of existence, and their digital avatars are becoming more valuable, more important than the actual physical beings themselves, right? So especially as they gather more information, that the computers are becoming better at knowing yourself than you are of you, right? Because they know your inner thoughts and things, and we can talk more about spiritual. We can talk about more about resurrection theory.
Well, yeah, but let's talk about the big data concepts, because that's another area where this confluence of corporate power and individual empowerment, or emerging culture and socio-political new ways of being, are kind of a little bit at odds, and it's a little bit of an open question. How far we should go in allowing big data to really be aggregating this stuff, because some of that stuff, it's of particular interest to life extensionists. Being able to get this medical data well beyond what we have, that some of that technology exists. It's a question of bringing that price point and those individual implementations into people's homes and lives. And you see a little bit of it here and there. The iWatch has we kind of talked about that. There's 100 kinds of things of that order of magnitude, but on the whole, and the big data stuff, it's not just it has a potential for being able to recreate an experience of a person, and that's a thing of particular interest to transhumanists. I really have tried to talk mostly about public health and policy issues, and it's not because the advanced algorithm stuff is something I find troubling. Far from it. I just I want to be bringing new people a little closer to ideas of what radical life extension could mean for them, and talking about some of the 20th century technologies, which I do place some stock in, like cryogenics. I don't know how much that advances that discussion. Cryogenics is an important thing to people in these organizations, and we have to respect that. But I have tended to talk about life extension as a public health goal, and resurrectionism as a longer term prospect. I wanted to talk to Lincoln Cannon about vitrification, because we started talking about the particulars of cryogenics, and vitrification is kind of that next step where you have a little bit better way of preserving the brain that would be a little bit easier to then restore. But we're not there yet, and so it's really better. We are closer to the Aubrey de Grey kind of theories, the SENS theories of life extension at this point, and I think that it's a little more relatable. It's a little less some kind of I don't want to say, but there's always there's urban legends around cryogenics. Walt Disney had his head frozen and that sort of thing. So it's better to go with stuff that's not going to be bringing out the worst in people in conversation. I think it's better to stay with the things that are going to be focusing the conversation on the human development stuff and public health stuff.
If Walt Disney had his head frozen, I think he would be terrified to find out the monster that Disney has turned into. I think he wouldn't be happy. He'd say, "All right, I'm done. Put me back to sleep."
When we bring him back in this from quantum form, he will be quite surprised at all the things that have been done in his name. I'm sure.
In his name, yeah, absolutely. Well, what I was gonna say is that in these debates, what's going on is that they're starting to place sentient value into these avatars. So that you know how, like, when you go into the store and you see a rating like a G to R18 plus, like on the rating on these things. Well, these ethics committees in the United Nations, because, well, it's bureaucratic, because they want to start eating their way into dictating what happens within video games and other things. But they're starting to say, well, what if these entities start to feel consciousness because of mind uploading and all this other stuff? Then we have to start regulating these virtual worlds as if they were real worlds. So if you're out there and you're just a video gamer and you're just saying, oh, it won't affect me, well, when they start coming for your video games and putting restrictions on them or whatever, or such virtue signaling or whatever, then you'll start to see the thing. But yeah, big data.
I think that that concept is one that I take some exception to in the transhumanist charter. I agree with it in principle as a longer term consideration, but that would be a design flaw that you would be building into a chatbot to make it feel something. So it wouldn't be something you would be doing accidentally. So if you did that, you would be doing something rather sadistic as well.
Have you seen the advert that was created by AI from Lexus, from the cars?
No, tell me about it.
So
well,
Kate,
I should say that I just wanted to finish that thought that
sure.
In the long term, we will be able to do that. But I think at that point we're kind of in a post-scarcity and a recursive self-improvement framework where a lot of bets are off, and then we do have to consider those AI concerns. But I think in the next 15 or 20 years, the idea of concerning ourselves too much with AI autonomy and human rights of said entities it's kind of a weird red herring for me.
Well, yeah, they're talking about it.
We'll get there. Yeah, we'll get there. So the AI Lexus commercial. Tell me about it.
Yeah. So I'm gonna have Kate Lutchik on, Kate from Kate Goes Tech. Anyway, she's really cool Ukrainian girl. She's very famous. She works for Forbes. Very big. And she did a panel with a whole bunch of guys from AI, an AI Lexus car and advertising company, and essentially what happened was they fed in pretty much every single car advert from the beginning of time into this AI learner, and it learnt, and then they fed in a whole bunch of emotional stimulus so that the car company actually learnt emotional stimulus from humans, and then it popped out an ad. And then they actually built straight off everything that AI said, and they built the whole advert. And it's so emotional because it goes in all these sorts of funny ways, but it's actually really emotional and really eats you up. AI is very powerful. AI is very powerful. I mean, this stuff is eating into our emotion. It's writing better car adverts than I could bloody write anyway.
Yeah, I did. I think that was that the same company that was also developing the AI generated screenplays, and then they wanted to kind of be doing short material first. Or it was certainly the same kind of style of algorithm. I did hear about that. I'm going to watch that when we're finished.
Yeah. It's absolutely like there was people crying in the audience, and it was crazy. But it was like it's just a machine writing this emotionally stirring stuff. And the interesting thing is they only fed it a few different types. So they fed it car ads. So it did the whole the car driving along with the ocean on one side and the generic green trees on the other, and it did all that. But the thing it wrote was about a car defeating the people and coming to life. It's very interesting. It wrote that itself. It said because at the end of the advert, it was getting tested, and it was going to get smashed, like one of those car test smash things where they test out the airbag or whatever. And the AI decided that it wrote into itself, saving itself from getting smashed, and because the car came alive as a machine. Very, very, very interesting advert, and it's all written by AI, and it's just a few inputs from car ads and some emotional sequences from Shakespeare and other things. It was incredible.
Wow. Yeah, and as we're staying, this kind of brings to mind hyper reality in general. As those of us who are staying at the vanguard of this, as we're experiencing increasing interactions with more sophisticated AI, there's not going to be a lot of dull moments for these people, for us. It's in the sense that people already talk about social media as, sometimes they say it's overwhelming. It's a nice cool drink of water from the fire hose. We're gonna, and that's essentially the kind of argument for Neuralace for the consumer beyond the otherly able person, that we need to facilitate this arms race so that we are able to manage these advanced algorithms that could otherwise run circles around us. An ad that's able to manipulate your emotions to such a degree, then that's a baby compared to what some of them are maybe even doing now, or being able to do in just a few years. We have to. We kind of have to be ready to really ride a certain kind of wave there, and that's not going to be. You can understand why people unplug.
Absolutely.
But you can also understand that there's so much knowledge and experience to be had from that, and so many great new things to build and great new worlds to explore in doing that. That we owe it to ourselves. If you're intellectually curious person or naturally curious person, you owe it to yourself, I think, to try and experience that. And it's also just a level of control over the world around you that human beings have not had the privilege of having in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. Planetary Type 1 is coming up quite fast. Hopefully we can get there in this century.
Yeah. Kardashev 1, I think so.
Kardashev 1, exactly, yeah. So even though, like, I argued, I haven't seen that part in the interview with yours and Isaac Arthur, but I argue that the Kardashev scale is, well, I agree with actually Isaac. I don't think it's the most handy scale because it's all based on energy, and I think it sounds like a GDP sort of outdated thing. But it's accurate in the fact that how much energy your society consumes is an approximate of how big and complex your society is, I guess.
Yeah, it was kind of articulated before a lot of systems theory had become so cemented in people's minds. And other the human development concepts. These kinds of things were not on the tips of people's tongues in the way that they are. So, I mean, it is a little bit of an older way, but some of the other ways that you could look at
it's better than GDP.
Yeah. I mean, in this kind of a far future framework, some of the other ways that you could look at it, they're not as easily understood or tracked as I think as the Kardashev scale. Human beings becoming immersed in metaverse concerns and advanced algorithm concerns. That's not as discrete a thing as industrialization.
How are you going, by the way? Because on your campaign, you're a far futurist thinker, and you're having to bring yourself back into time frames of to 10 years. So how are you going with that? Because I want to use that as a launch pad into, let's get into Isaac Arthur and let's get into space colonization. So how are you going with that psychological jump of coming back to a near reality?
Yeah. It's not that hard. A lot of my favorite science fiction writers in the UK or in the US, Cory Doctorow is a big one. Charlie Stross is a really big one, and some of their more seminal works of literary fiction really revolve around metaverse concepts and digital concepts, but in a sort of a not too distant future. That gag. And so that's there's a lot of science fiction writers who I admire, going back many years, but those guys really kind of touch touched upon something for me that made me think. I think in a way that people enjoyed Neil Stephenson. I have enjoyed his work, but people talk about him the way I kind of feel about Charlie Strauss. That that he kind of opened up a lot of metaverse concepts and a lot of technologies that I said, well, hey, that technology, that seems like based on what I'm seeing in advanced algorithms of today, that's only 8 years off or 13 years off. And that has tended to be the way I like to think about these things. If you talk it's very interesting to talk to somebody like Isaac Arthur. It's incredible, but I definitely do prefer a lot of the talks that he does that are very much focused on upgrading the human condition and human development related ideas. And so it wasn't a huge leap for me to be tending to focus on that in constructing these talking points and materials. But it takes a kind of discipline, I think, to be talking to people about UBI and about e-governance spectrum reforms, and then relating that to transhumanist things. And I think that not all transhumanists see the importance of that, and as a result, not all ordinary people see the importance of transhumanists. I think, and so we owe it to them to try and because the end game for me is nothing. It's not to live in a wonderful science fiction world. It's to live in a world of life extension and a world of providence for my fellow man. And I think that if you are able to frame the discussion in both of those terms, you can find a little something for everyone to kind of bring them together in that way.
Yeah, because everyone all of a sudden realizes what it's all about when their loved one or their grandpa or whatever is on the bed dying. Then they go, oh, maybe I should have listened all those years, because they wake up at some point. But, when life's happening, I think people are a bit short-sighted, or they're too worried about really, really super short-term problems of what's my next meal, sort of this primate thing. And they really sort of don't forget. And then they wake up in their 60 and they're like, oh, what's going on? So, yeah, it's interesting. So let's talk about space colonization. Okay, so you talked about Isaac Arthur. He's great, isn't he? So the elevator. Let's go on about the elevator. Tell us about the elevator. Are we going to get an elevator before 2050? And who's going to own it? Is it Japan?
It's very likely that Japan will have. There's a 2045 timeline for a space elevator company. There's a 2050 timeline. And there's a few competing organizations. Japan is the most advanced of these. Some of the a lot of the materials and construction could already be well underway, and much of it is well underway, except that the difficulties of the tether, which is why I looked specifically at this Agapov orbital lift prospectus, which is a limited, in the sense. This is
because there's three main parts to the space elevators. There's the platform on the sea. There's the platform up above the Earth, which would be and then there's the tether, right? The carbon nanotube, what we think might be carbon nanotubing tether, as you would call it. And all three components are extremely difficult to create, because the platform on the sea, you're going to have it in the middle of the sea, because what if the tether collapses eventually? It's going to, if it's in the middle of a city, it's going to just wipe a city out like a nuclear bomb. We're talking about kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of tether. It's going to take hours to go up there.
Well, the tether whiplash concept. The nanotube tether is it's a relatively low risk of that happening because it would be quite slender, and it's not likely to hit urban areas, and even if it did, not likely to have the kind of effect that that you might suppose.
Just a vertical drop.
There are real concerns about this thing collapsing. However, for example, if a person, but even Isaac Arthur talked about this as well. The losing control of one of the actual elevators in and the design that I worked on is an industrial space elevator. It's not for tourists, but if a tourist got stranded on one of these things, it's be far less dangerous for them than being in an airplane crash. In actually what would happen? They'd have to be retrieved. They would have an unpleasant time, maybe a little bit of a scary free fall, and then they would have to be, but they would not be harmed. It's quite unlikely based on these designs. But I haven't looked as much at the space tourism designs because the carbon nanotube doesn't exist. It exists in a few meters in length, but it doesn't exist in 22,000 miles in length. and there's ways that gluing could be used to maybe implement that. And I've looked at a few of those materials science ideas, but it seems that the best thing to do would be to kind of do what's already been done. The space elevator is effectively already built. If you can see that a space elevator with a Kevlar tether of a few 100 meters is a space elevator, or a polyfiber tether. So this the Agapov lift is effectively a blend of these polyfibers like Kevlar, and it's only about 10% of the distance, and that's the length that you could first build using these polyfibers until the nanofibers are available. But in doing so, you could reduce the fuel costs pretty significantly by maybe 30, 40, 50%, depending on the usage. And so even though it's 10% of the distance, you're able to use other kinds of rocketry more in line with the kinds of things that we just most ordinarily take, airplanes that have a little bit greater capacity for getting a little closer to near Earth orbit, and then having a little easier time not having to have this huge blast to escape Earth's gravity. 2,000 miles. It seems like the short distance relative to the full 22,000 miles that would be required to go to the moon, but it would reduce costs. And I think most importantly, it's just you then have this trade network toward near Earth industrialization. You're able to really have people working on the solar arrays. You're really able to have more and more teams working on the mini satellites, getting that data beamed to everybody, and a half a dozen other very useful things, and not least of which, or perhaps, certainly high on the to-do list, would just be cleaning up some space junk. That's part of the problem with building the tether, is that there's a lot of space junk that would interfere with that. So you gotta kind of work on that too.
Industrial street sweepers up there, because there's a lot of space junk. It's becoming a very littered space place. In Star Wars and other ones, but in Star Wars, how they fix it around Coruscant is actually they basically breed up giant worms that just feed on the space junk, and they just go around and organically get it. I don't know, but it's kind of interesting. But so Japan is in the race. America, but that's Japan. As long as Japan and America remain allies from now till then, which looks very likely because of China, that would give America access. Is America? I mean, America. I know America's developing it. How far along is it in developing it? Do you know?
It's not been as big of a push in private space concerns as space tourism of other kinds has been, and other
Virgin Galactic, right? So it's pushing pressure off the space elevator because of Virgin Galactic.
Yeah, and also these other private space concerns have made legitimate breakthroughs in reducing their own rocketry costs, which have sort of given them a kind of reprieve on finding these focusing too much on these other better methods. But yeah, the U.S. is a little bit behind on this stuff. It definitely seems like East Asia will be the place to be for that sort of leapfrogging of near Earth industrialization. So probably as we're seeing that some of that's starting to happen, maybe time to be thinking about looking at some new investments.
Do you think that's part of America's plan? Sit back, use reusable rockets until that advantage wanes out. Japan invents, or somebody else invents it. That source is outsourced, and then use your advantage to just buy up the technology, and you're done.
Yeah, I mean, the United States is in some ways the seat of a lot of, the Silicon Valley and a lot of advanced technology, and so there's this kind of, they're pretty happy to just kind of have brain drain into certain industries and not necessarily build up every industry. I think that's and also it is this huge structural undertaking. As Elon Musk says, the reason that we don't have a space elevator is the same reason that we don't have a bridge from Australia to the United States. It'd be enormous structural engineering feat to do so. That's a fair point, but I think when you're talking about ultimately many trillions of dollars, mining, and all these other new industries being opened up, I think a little bit more excitement about this kind of thing is warranted.
The only reason I say that is because they know this. I mean, I watch Congress all the time, and they talk about the trillionaires and the mining of the asteroids and how they're competing with Russia to try and get the moon and all this stuff. It's like they know it. So is it? Well, you understand what I mean? So they know. So it's either they know and they don't care, or they know and they don't see it as a problem, or they know and they have another strategy. It must be they know and they have another strategy. That's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, well, the United States is in a very real sense a kind of empire, but it's not a sort of omnipotent force. There's just in the way that the United States in undertaking wars kind of and espionage kind of had a little blind spot about the role of cyber wars and influence operations specifically in the cyber war context, and that was something that costs a lot less to do. That's some of the reason that other countries were doing it more than the U.S. It was just the price point was a point that they could kind of afford, and but it's a lot. It's kind of a lot more effective. It's kind of you might kind of say the same thing about many industries. These the Silicon Valley is very much consumer driven, and some of those consumer products, their contribution to techno progress is a little questionable. There's an awful lot of if you really rank apps in terms of what they do for people, a lot of them do a lot of great things. A lot of them are not contributing a whole lot to people's lives, but they're fun, and so there's always going to be kind of like holes, I think, in the marketplace of this kind, and the U.S. has those, and I think, in my view, near Earth industrialization is kind of a big one. But there are any number of U.S. investors who are, this is kind of international undertakings, just as some of the space tourism undertakings involve investors from the U.S. and Europe, and so there's a lot of different ways that this sort of thing can be looked at, I guess.
So what else did you pick Isaac's brains about? Do you have any other highlights from that topic that you want to talk about?
Yeah. So it was a recurring theme that we've been talking about with people, and it's just because it's a thing in the news. We kind of just talked indirectly a little bit about Elon Musk, and also talking about Neuralace. I think transhumanists in particular, people who want to see this technology advanced into human trials as soon as possible, and they want to see regulations being such that ordinary human beings are themselves allowed to have these 10,000 neurons being cloned. Kind of short way of saying it. And having this more robust brain-computer interface than humans are able to experience now. Those numbers are quite low, but people who are using these are having 250 or 300 neurons and able to have some pretty cool gaming experiences and browser experiences and ordinary interfaces experiences. So the 10,000 kind of allows for a much more a whole range of kind of hyper realities and a whole range of productivities that we're not experiencing, and that has incredible implications. It's a great force multiplier, and people working together on projects. We have be able to. I think that something like Neuralace will allow us to build the space elevator. I think that it will give us the kind of man hours that we would require to undertake something like this, solving this tether problem, solving some of these other problems that are more economic problems, but still those force multipliers kind of go across those disciplines. So yeah, please.
Oh, so you mentioned something very interesting there. A theme that you mentioned was more productivity per man hour, a force multiplier, right? And the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what happened. And this happened in sort of other ways with the water wheel and with the blacksmith and other things. The production lines of, if you go back to ancient Egypt, you can go and find production lines of food and stuff like that. But really, we talk about the Industrial Revolution as the beginnings of more productivity per man hour, because it was built out to a large consumer market, built off the back of the Agrarian Revolution. Which is the fundamental part, because you had the massive increase of food and every more products per man hour, and that was putting components together. That was shifting one thing to another to create a car in a small increments, so that you could produce more of something. What you're saying here is you've disappeared. What you're saying here is that with Neuralink and with neuralacing and stuff like that, we can produce as humans, we can produce more information, cognitive processes per hour, per man hour. It's an industrial revolution in the information age, in our heads. It's reduced to our heads.
Yeah, and that's not the only force multiplier. We have, it's hard to imagine as you're using your digital assistant now, your Cortana, Alexa, and so forth. I'm standing right by her, so I hope she doesn't wake up. But it's hard to imagine that is so much more dramatically a force multiplier than the smartphone that you're using. But that natural language processing is made a significant improvements in this area. Some of these things, they're not quite sure how to roll every aspect of it out into these consumer products. But all of these advanced algorithms, in conjunction with these brain-computer interfaces, it's going to create a set of interaction effects towards those greater productivity outputs. And it's why, I don't think that it's so absurd to talk about some of these longer term, to set the bar relatively high in terms of some of these longer term techno-futurist goals. Nobody gets anything if they don't ask for it. And so I think it's reasonable to ask for a universal longevity escape velocity in this context. I think it's reasonable to ask for leaving Earth in a period of to some lunar habitat in a period of some years. The point is that we have resources available to us at the consumer level, increasingly that were unimagined even just 10 years ago. I don't see those trends reversing for those greater and greater interaction effects with those force multipliers and new advanced algorithms being of great help to us. I apologize. I did go to speaker. I do have this issue with my battery getting a little bit low.
That's okay. We're good on the echo. It's fine. Yeah. And the other thing is like, people are becoming powerless to stop some of these advances. So something big in the world right now that a lot of people are complaining about is 5G. Okay, they like to always complain about the next thing, but they're saying 5G is a brain cancerous weapon. It's going to turn all the chips in our heads on and create us all cyborg robots who are subservient to a new global world order government thing. But they said this about 4G. They said it about all the other ones. They say it all the time. But the other thing is they're becoming powerless to stop it. I mean, there's a huge global movement against 5G in a way. And it doesn't matter. 5G is being rolled out, whether people like it or not. So, and you know, it's happened across the world. You know, Bill Gates said, "I can't wait until there's a computer in every home," and people are going, "What's this guy talking about? What the hell is a computer?" Next minute, there is a computer in everybody's home. Not only just everybody's home, it's in everybody's pocket. Now it's coming into your brain. You know, people are becoming powerless to stop this, whether they like it or not. And so, like, it's kind of like, if you want to be a techno Luddite, like now is your chance, because it's becoming runaway, because there's too many passive consumer, because this is what they do. They create passive consumer products on one side to get people in, like your Alexa over there. Not that that's a passive consumer product, but they do this to get money to run these higher end products and do the Neuralink, you know what I mean? And I mean that's kind of what Elon Musk is doing. He's doing SpaceX on one side to get enough money to do Neuralink on the other.
That's a good black pill callback from our earlier conversation, the concerns about 5G, because I do think that there's something quite a little nihilistic about some of those conversations that people are having. Now, cancer is not a joke. Okay, I laughed. But it's not a joke. It's a serious medical condition that affects conceivably everyone in a long enough lifespan, and it certainly affects an awful lot of people that I know, a lot of people that you know. Everybody has been affected by this affliction, but it is we have an awful lot of forms of cancer are highly treatable now, and increasingly so. You know, every year. More kinds of preventative measures for and early treatment options for different kinds of cancer. There's only a few kinds of cancer that can be treated at any stage. But the point being, like we shouldn't stop using these technologies that have improved our lives so much. For fear of cancer, we should focus on using them to cure cancer. But there's other concerns that are maybe a little more philosophical, like you said, about this becoming IoT becoming so pervasive, about advanced algorithms insinuating themselves into people's lives, and the people in the United States are very individualist minded, and there's certainly things to recommend that mindset in many circumstances, but I think that sometimes that leads to some of these kind of operatic kind of concerns about where, you know, a person's casting themselves as a great hero fighting some horrible villainy, and sometimes that thing is something that you know has good and bad aspects to it, as this particular emerging technology does. So yeah, there's environmental impacts and health impacts that are very real, and there's concerns about people losing some a degree of their previous traditional lifestyle or autonomy. Those are all very real things, but I don't think that they're problems that we can't solve. You know, and if somebody had asked me in 1992, it's kind of young, but if I thought that cell phones were going to become as pervasive as they were, you know, I'm not a Ray Kurzweil in 1992. I was a small child, but there were cell phones at that time, and most people, if you had asked them in the early 1990s, what do you think is going to be coming about with cell phones, they were focused on those health concerns, and we don't have a full understanding of the extent to which a certain constellation of health concerns, mostly kinds of cancer, are being contributed to by the use of this specific set of digital technologies. It's clearly not negligible, and yet it's also not contributing to some terrible epidemic of open cancerous sores in everyone, and brain cancer for everyone who's been using cell phones now for 15 years. So it seems like a pretty managed public health risk, and it seems like most of the concerns, I think, are kind of a twist on the runaway AI concept. You know, people are concerned that this 5G is just it's kind of most of these counter arguments are couched in talk about what is natural for human beings or what is healthy for human beings, but sometimes it gets a little vague. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a quote. There's no. I think this is out of the Futurist New Deal. I'm not sure, but it's no issue or there is no issue or person more important than preventing 100,000 Americans from dying in the street like dogs every day. Is that out of the New Deal?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great quote. Like, because the death industry is so large, it's getting fat on the deaths of people. I mean, let's put them out of business. I mean, isn't that the idea? And why?
Well, you in Australia are lucky to have a public health service that does that basic work at a little better level than what we have. And I was talking to one of the syncretic religious guys that I interviewed recently. We've kind of talked about them a little bit already. I don't want to call that back too much, but we were talking about the funerary business and related businesses in the United States. People have a high expectation that when their loved one passes, that they should spend a certain amount of money on giving them a nice send-off, and that's a pretty reasonable thing that people hold to. But the cost of those industries and related industries, if it were nationalized and put to another purpose, we could fund about 10% of public health service in the United States. So they regard this indignity to the dead as a kind of quasi-humanitarian crisis, but they don't. For some reason, we don't regard people actually living longer, having access to healthcare, as a humanitarian crisis. We just regard that as kind of an act of God. So that's to me, that's kind of the fatalistic ideas that we want to be moving past, and not that this particular industry is bad, or that every aspect of a public health service in another country is what needs to be implemented in the United States, but those standards need to be implemented. And for transhumanists particularly, if we want to get to a point of universal radical life extension, we don't want those technologies to not be developed or be orphan technologies because there's kind of a lack of interest or an unnecessary skepticism about these prospects. We want people to have that baseline of care, the single payer program, or an equivalent level of care for everyone, and also an optimism for moving beyond that to where you have the constant monitoring of your physical health. and that becomes the sort of in the sort of Bill of Rights.
It's so interesting because like there seems to be this divergence. Like there's this theory of opinion where people, maybe it's taboo, maybe it's a taboo subject, because they don't want to talk about it. Because I had a friend, and he has built a funeral business. Actually, he's doing quite well because, as you know, demographics dictate the baby boomers are dying in mass numbers, and he's he's close to a millionaire, and he only started like a few years ago, and he's doing very well off that. And I said, what was your sort of motivation? And he said, well, somebody's got to do it. There's a lot of money in it right now. I mean, it's not a happy thing, but it's something that's there and exists, and you can make a lot of money, and stuff. And I said, well, what do you think about like how much you're getting paid versus how much a doctor or something like that? And he said, well, it's just the market. Like it's just the way it is. It's just people dignify the dead in a cultural way. It reminds me of the processes of the death sort of culture in the West. It reminds me of the embalming in Egypt. It reminds me of a process of culture, as on reflection of they dump these problems onto a system, okay, if you know what I mean. So it's like, well, I don't actually want to deal with the reality of it, so I'm going to pay for you to do the thing that you do, and not actually deal with the reality and the steps of how you got there. But because the steps of how you got to the position of being buried is so profitable in the fact of curing it, that's where the market comes in, and that's where, and all the markets, the political markets, where you can say, all right, I'm going to do healthcare for all, or I want a private system, or I'm going to do a biotech company that's going to innovate and fix this, or I'm going to do a medical tech company, we're going to invent medicines, or do vitamins or something like that to extend human life. I mean, all the markets open up, and there's money in there, both through the politics and through the private sector that that involve longevity. But it feels like to me that people get caught up in life, they get caught up in the moment, and then suddenly they wake up and it's too late to actually step outside of the cultural context, and either they go loony, and you see them sometimes on the street where they're running around naked, or they end up just sitting around in church meditating all day because they're so scared and petrified of what's going to happen, so they have to outsource that problem to the church. And then there's the odd one, the eccentrics or semi-eccentrics, who actually go and, I'm going to fix this problem, and I call myself a transhumanist, and I'm actually going to invest my life and my money and my processes and my resources into stepping outside of the culture and actually going deep into these what are considered in a way taboo topics in the West, at least. Now, this isn't carried. This is a very Western styled cultural influence. I know that this isn't mandatory over a lot of the cultures, but that's kind of how it is. I mean, that's what I see. It's an Egyptian embalming mechanism.
There's no shortage of areas, where there's some kind of pageantry that is enacted. Some kind of rite or ritual, and we don't always think of it as a rite or ritual, but and that's deriving sometimes from being able to deal with losses or life stressors so directly. So we kind of have some roundabout release valve for it, and religion's one of them, and this kind of these rites around death are certainly one, but it's hard to be sometimes in conversations of this kind, one time I was referred to as a cultural Marxist, that I wasn't respecting some of these notions that are that have this great historical track record enough. So I was described as cultural Marxist, and you don't. I guess you don't want to just run afoul of everyone you meet by just disgrace, by ruffling their feathers about every taboo that they happen to hold. But at the same time, to get to that world where you have these Matryoshka brains. You alluded to Isaac Arthur's some of his discussions of building, turning an entire planet or turning Uranus into a big computer. You know, those are not like, if you're focused on some tribalist morality of hundreds of years ago, you're not able to have conversations where you're building computronium or doing really incredible things. You're focusing on reliving all of these let go of, but yet, you know, in socio-political terms or industrial terms, some of those things just represent a huge money pit that we're just throwing money into or throwing resources into, that's not having a real great payoff for us. So, you know, it's why in these conversations, rather than just saying, you know, I want to be a cultural Marxist, I would prefer to say I want to support someone like Lincoln Cannon, who I think, or someone like Micah Redding, who really has their head screwed on with respecting these ideas, but using them in a more productive way for 21st century goals.
Yeah, Michael Redding, he seems really inspiring. Michael Redding for Pope, that's what I said. What a great guy. I mean, this is someone I really want to talk to, because I really want him to introduce these concepts of longevity and the Christian experience back into Christianity, because I mean Christianity's been all over the place since the start of time. Why not continue to be all over the place? I mean, there's no consistent theme, so just continue down that track.
Yeah, and people, you know, people who regard themselves as being quite liberal, you know, it's kind of something that was shifted in the early 20th century. And Margaret Mead is someone who's associated with this, an idea that, you know, it's reflected in Star Trek. You know, it's kind of a nonsensical idea, the prime directive, right? Like you can't change things. Why can't you change things? Because reasons. Because changing things would be bad. That's the hand wave. Yeah, that is reflected in the idea of a lot of liberal people in the United States, and maybe in a lot of parts of the developed world, that we have to respect religion, and a part of respecting religion is respecting the old traditions and not really describing how that may relate to 21st century life. That to me is it's not respecting anyone. It's a little bit like the way that intellectual property law has evolved in the United States, if you'll forgive the analogy. You know, what do you do if you want to write a song? You listen to a song that you love many times, and listen to some other similar songs, and start playing with variations on themes, and start the best way to make something is really to steal from other people, but that's not reflected in an intellectual property law. The idea is that it should be a thing that it just comes to you in a dream, and it's purely yours. That's not really reality for people making things. But and it's kind of the same way, I think, with emergent culture. It has to be something that evolves from other ideas and evolves from groups of people, and it has to be something that's fluid enough to be of use in that context. Not something that's basically codified into law, as in, you know, not actual law, but it's taboo to have it evolve or be challenged or toyed with. But something that is just a much more fluid kind of marketplace.
All right, so
I think that's a good way. That's a good way to approach religious syncretism. It's a good way to approach a lot of emerging culture.
Absolutely. So in the last few minutes, let's talk about your primary again, and let's talk about the other candidates. So you're in a primary with two other candidates. You've got Mr. Holsopple and you've got Rachel Haywire. and yourself. And how do you think they're all doing? What do you have any comments? I wanted to touch briefly on something that was said between a little banter that went on between you and Haywire. You said in a quote that basically you can't compete with bikini pics. What did you mean by that?
Okay. Did I say that? Did I say was that?
I read that on her blog. She's saying that you said that. So.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That was a post. Well, I mean, she's spending a lot of time making videos where she's heavily made up, and you know, it's a certain kind of approach. It is appealing to people. Some of this content, it's a little light on bringing a lot of new information, and you know, she did work as some kind of model, not you know, like you know, somebody that you would look up online and sort of like get their services. Obviously, even whatever the context of that, you know, I'm for it. People should be allowed to do it, and I shouldn't be kind of making jokes about her what her persona is as colorful as it may be. So you know, I kind of maybe owe her an apology on that score. But at the same time, this is a lot of people are saying this kind of thing that we're not presenting the most serious-minded of faces of the transhumanist party if we're doing this kind of model routine and a lot of this makeup. So you know, maybe I am getting a little worn out with all of these interviews. You know, because I did kind of push that a little too far. But you know, there's a lot of stuff you know that she's said and done in the past that I don't agree with. I'm not seeing a lot of ways to engage her other than kind of trying to push some of these buttons, because she's not going out there and really putting herself out there on the campaign trail. She's just kind of resting on these laurels from things that she's done in the past.
Well, yeah, it is commendable how many interviews you've done. You've done a great job on that. You know, and hopefully you can sustain that effort for a bit further. You know, get some rest, get some sleep, and continue that, because unlike some of these other politicians, you don't just work off talking points, which is commendable. You actually have to think ingeniously and indigenously think about a lot of the answers. And not just have a set talking points which just get fed into the mainstream drama of things. Although, you know, as you become, if whoever becomes a candidate, I think that's a good strategy to employ. But you do have to pick some fights with some people along the way in order to get that broadcast recognition. So that's a tip for whoever wins. But yeah, no, I'm just seeing. I'm thank you for coming on the show, because you know, you're doing a good job. You know, there's a lot of information going on out there. That the candidates are all really strong. They all have really good ideas. The 222 Futurist New Deal is very strong, and Rachel Haywire's Art New Right is a good book. I just finished it. It's very good. So yeah, so these are all strong. Any other comments on these people or your campaign?
No, they're both nice people, and they both have good platforms. As I've said before, I was so pleasantly surprised that we have these coherent platforms and these platforms that reflect real reforms that I think would help people, and particularly her basic income. It is commendable. You know, this conversation came up in the context not of some discovered bikini pictures or whatever. I don't think that's a thing. I think that not that it's whatever I said was taking it out of context there, but somebody else commented on the bikini comment from some time ago. I mean, people are allowed to wear whatever they want, and people are also allowed to. I think, you know, it's a little strange that we have some set of standards of practices for one discipline and not for another. You know, but whatever. This came up in the context of her not wanting to go to Radfest, and you know, it was a discussion that she said that the Transhumanist Party is quite small. I have the head of the Arizona chapter. It's like the U.S. National Party. It's not a dues collecting organization, and there's some funds there. This just for that organization, the U.S. Transhumanist Party. It's just maintaining this the barest of necessities, and so it was stated as we all signed up to prepare for this campaign that we would have to raise funds for these kinds of events, and then we have to participate in these kind of events. And so Rachel Haywire was making noise that she was not going to go to Radfest, and it put me off my lunch a little bit. I've gone to 3 Radfest affiliated sort of events in the last few weeks. I would happily go to Radfest in the fall to attend this. So the idea that this front runner is saying that who's not really campaigning to the same degree that I am is also saying that she's not even going to participate in the basic events that we all had to sign on to as a condition of the of participating in this race. It kind of, there's a certain kind of hypocrisy to it. There's a certain kind of hypocrisy to some of these things in her history as well. And I don't think it's out of bounds to be asking people what they think about some of this stuff. She's gotten into trouble in the past, and she used to be very much a far right personality. That's those ideas that she's espoused in the past are not consistent with somebody who would advance a basic income. Now, maybe she's really turned over a new leaf, but a lot of the stuff that she says, to me, it reflects still a lot of those more questionable goals, and maybe that's a matter of opinion. But
can people evolve their political opinion?
Yeah, I think so. But okay, so the interactions that I've had with her and her supporters, I mean, if every one of her supporters is immediately turning to some kind of sort of racist trope or some kind of like a joke about how silly it is to be concerned with social justice, like, isn't this kind of a social justice platform that she's promoting? How come all of her supporters and herself are just kind of making glib comments about these communities that she's supposed to be now a great champion of?
Are people responsible for the people who support them?
Yeah, I mean, if they're operating as campaign proxies, and she's echoing some of those same sentiments, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this isn't a race, of involving many layers of contact. These are people that she's interacting with. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to necessarily make a huge deal about this, but yeah, there's, so like,
I'll have her on the show and see what she says, and you can watch that and tell. Yeah. I'll ask her what
I mean, she has. There's a number of websites where people are talking about. Basically, some of them are disgruntled customers. Apparently, one of them was a very unsavory individual who engaged in some illegal activity, and there's civil and criminal actions against him for what he did to Rachel Haywire, according to Rachel Haywire, according to some reasonable documentation. But there seems to be a lot of people who are a little bit unhappy with the kind of products that she was offering as a record producer, and not offering, and specious crowdfunding efforts that didn't really pay off. Yeah, maybe everybody who's ever hung out a shingle has some disgruntled customers. Is it wrong to ask if this person who's now maybe trying to shake down the Transhumanist Party in kind of, or kind of making weird moves along those lines, who's definitely had some people who they've severed ties with them permanently on a lot of times throughout her career, on the basis of questionable business decisions and practices. Is it completely taboo that we should bring this subject up because it's not the most savory of subjects? So, I mean, this is stuff that happened, and I don't know. I don't think it's disqualifying. I don't just in the way that you said. You know, maybe not having been a techno-fascist, neo-reactionary, maybe she's turned over a new leaf. But we're talking about a small party that doesn't have the mechanisms to be raising a lot of money, and somebody who's saying that she's not going to do the work that she said that she was going to do because unless they give her more money, and it's just the whole thing kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, and even my handling of it leaves a bad taste in my mouth now. But I mean, there's Charles Holzapfel was never a techno-fascist. Charles Holzapfel doesn't have 20 people devoting entire web pages to not warning you not to do business with Rachel Haywire. I don't have those histories. So, are we just supposed to ignore all of this stuff? I guess if we are, then we are. We should ignore it.
That is some absolute controversy. I'll try and get her on if she feel like coming on and to explain herself and see what she has to say. So that's really good. I'll let you go because you look at you go. You're worn out from campaigning, but stay strong. Keep campaigning because as we said, we've got about a week, 4 days, so 10 days left ish. So stay strong and we'll get back to you ASAP.
Thank you, sir, Steele. And we'll I mean. It is what it is. I hate that phrase. I don't wish Rachel ill in this. I don't think that she's a bad person. She's had an awful lot of a storied life, doing a lot of wonderful things for radical life extension, for transhumanists. But if something happened, we have a president in the United States who's a con artist because another candidate soft pedaled that person's failings and kind of propped them up as a suitable sort of person, and in a lot of certain dimensions, kind of an incompetent person. I mean, should we always just concern ourselves solely with issues of propriety, or should we actually concern ourselves with maybe trying to discuss the matters in the fullest way possible and talk about best outcomes? I mean,
the population wants they want chants, they want slogans. That's all they want.
Yeah, and
it's politics.
Nice. Well, I hope that the nice words will be said, and everyone will be happy.
Everybody, that's Unshackled. Visit the unshackled.net. There's more detonation coming to you all this week. Thank you very much, Johann, and all the best with your campaign.
All right. We'll talk soon. Thank you.